At the United Nations in New York, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva stepped before the microphones with confidence. At 79 years old, Lula has seen decades of political highs and lows, but this moment carried special weight. His words were not only for Brazil, but also for the world. His upcoming meeting with US President Donald Trump, he declared, would mark a turning point in relations between Brasilia and Washington. The Brazilian leader began with a simple, hopeful vision. I hope that sitting at a table, I, him, his advisors and my advisors, we can restore the necessary harmony that must exist between Brazil and the United States. The tone was measured, but the message unmistakable. Dialogue, Lula insisted, is the first step to repairing a relationship now strained by weeks of disagreement, but Lula did not shy away from calling out the source of those tensions. I think he is misinformed about Brazil, and that this may have led him to make certain decisions that are not acceptable in the relationship between two countries that have had diplomatic relations for more than 200 years. With this, Lula subtly pointed to Trump's recent policies and remarks about Brazil, whether on trade, the environment, or sovereignty. His phrasing was careful, describing the US president as misinformed rather than malicious. Yet the rebuke was clear. Decisions had been taken in Washington that undermined trust. Still, Lula's message was not one of confrontation, it was one of resolution. When this meeting takes place, I think everything will be resolved and Brazil and the United States will live in harmony and stability again. For Lula, the stakes were bigger than any single dispute. He cast the meeting as a moment to reset an entire bilateral relationship, one of the largest in the Western Hemisphere. Then came a personal reflection, perhaps the most revealing line of all. I had another satisfaction of having a meeting with President Trump. What seemed impossible stopped being impossible and happened. And I was happy when he said that a good alchemy was created between us. That word, alchemy, stood out. It suggested that beyond politics, beyond disagreements, there was personal chemistry. Lula seemed to believe that the connection between two leaders could be enough to steer two nations away from discord. Returning to his central theme, Lula emphasized optimism. I now return to Brazil, satisfied with our meeting, optimistic about having this meeting as soon as possible and putting an end to the malaise that exists today in the relationship between Brazil and the United States. His message was clear. The problems are real, but they are not insurmountable. Lula insisted that through dialogue, the malaise, that lingering sense of distrust, could finally be dispelled. But in his closing words, Lula also drew a red line. What is not debatable? Brazilian sovereignty. Our democracy is not negotiable, neither with President Trump nor with any other president in the world. With this, he reminded both domestic and international audiences that while compromise was possible, Brazil's independence was not up for negotiation. The sovereignty of Brazil, its democracy, its institutions, these were non-negotiable principles. These remarks were delivered with precision, and behind them lies a broader story. The relationship between Brazil and the United States has always been complex, a mix of partnership and rivalry, mutual admiration and periodic frustration. For more than 2 centuries, the two nations have shared deep ties in trade, diplomacy, and culture. Yet at critical junctures, disputes over sovereignty, environmental protection, and economic policy have flared up. In recent months, those disputes had escalated again. Washington questioned Brazil's trade practices and demanded stronger action on Amazon deforestation. Brasilia countered by defending its right to make decisions free from foreign interference. Both sides felt the tension. It was against this backdrop that Lula spoke at the UN. His appeal for harmony was not just diplomatic nicety, it was urgent necessity. Observers noted the careful balance Lula struck. On one hand, he acknowledged that Trump had been misinformed and had taken unacceptable decisions. On the other, he extended an olive branch, suggesting that personal diplomacy could overcome misinformation. This approach reflects Lula's broader strategy as a statesman. Throughout his career, he has positioned Brazil as a mediator in international disputes, a voice for the global South, and a country that speaks on equal terms with major powers. His words in New York fit that pattern, assertive on sovereignty, but conciliatory in tone. In Washington, the reaction was mixed. Supporters of dialogue welcomed Lula's optimism. Critics doubted whether Trump would soften his stance. For many in the US political establishment, Brazil's independence on foreign policy has long been a source of tension, particularly when Brasilia takes positions diverging from Washington at the United Nations or in trade negotiations. Whether Lula's alchemy with Trump could change that calculus remained uncertain. At home in Brazil, Lula's comments were carefully scrutinized. Supporters saw a seasoned diplomat seeking reconciliation with the world's most powerful nation. They praised his ability to stand firm on sovereignty while also extending a hand of friendship. Critics, however, argued that Lula was being overly optimistic about Trump's willingness to compromise. Some feared that Brazil might bend too far under US pressure. Lula's clear statement that democracy and sovereignty are non-negotiable was likely aimed at easing those fears. Internationally, Lula's remarks resonated beyond just US-Brazil relations. Leaders in Africa, Asia and Latin America, many of whom have faced similar pressures from Washington, saw his words as an assertion of global South independence. For them, Lula's stance underscored a principle. Partnerships with powerful nations must be based on respect, not subordination. The reference to alchemy also carried symbolic meaning. Diplomacy often hinges not just on policy papers or treaties, but on the personal rapport between leaders. The suggestion that Lula and Trump had found chemistry, however unlikely it might seem, offered a glimmer of hope. It echoed past moments in history where unexpected personal bonds shifted geopolitical landscapes, even if only temporarily. Yet the question remains, can personal chemistry resolve structural disputes? Lula's optimism is evident, but the issues at stake, trade imbalances, environmental policy, regional security, require concrete agreements. His confidence may reassure supporters, but seasoned observers caution that optimism alone cannot bridge deep divides. Nevertheless, Lula's framing of the upcoming meeting as a chance to restore harmony matters. It sets expectations not just for Brazil and the United States, but for the international community. In a world often defined by escalating tensions, Lula's call for dialogue stands out as a counterpoint to the trend of confrontation. As Lula departed New York, his message echoed, "The malaise between Brazil and the United States can end if leaders are willing to sit at the same table and speak openly." He left confident, satisfied, and ready to return home with the promise of a meeting that could shift the course of relations between two hemispheric giants. For now, the world waits. The details of the Lula-Trump meeting have yet to be finalized. The topics on the table are weighty: trade, the Amazon, sovereignty, democracy. But Lula has placed his bet on diplomacy. He believes that what seemed impossible can become possible, that through dialogue, harmony can be restored. In the end, his closing words at the UN summarize both his optimism and his defiance. Sovereignty is not negotiable. Democracy is not negotiable, and Brazil will meet the United States as an equal partner. The chemistry between two presidents may set the tone, but the future of US-Brazil relations will depend on what is built from that chemistry.
Para ele, eu espero que sentado numa mesa, ele, os assessores dele, meus assessores, a gente possa restabelecer a harmonia necessária que tem que ter entre Brasil e Estados Unidos. E eu acho que ele está mal informado com relação ao Brasil e possivelmente isso tenha levado ele a tomar algumas decisões que não são aceitáveis na relação de dois países que têm relação diplomática há mais de 200 anos. Então, na hora que a gente tiver o encontro, eu acho que tudo isso ficará resolvido. E o Brasil e os Estados Unidos voltarão a viver em harmonia e quimicamente estáveis. Eu tive uma outra satisfação de ter um encontro com o presidente Trump. Aquilo que parecia impossível deixou de ser impossível e aconteceu. E eu fiquei feliz quando ele disse na COP que pintou uma química boa entre nós. Bem, então eu volto agora para o Brasil, satisfeito com a nossa reunião, otimista com a possibilidade de Brasil e Estados Unidos fazer uma reunião, o mais rápido possível e acabar com o mal-estar que existe hoje na relação Brasil-Estados Unidos. Veja, o que não é discutível é a soberania brasileira. E a nossa democracia, isso não é discutível. Nem com o presidente Trump, nem com nenhum presidente do mundo.